Hi,
Thank you
Michelle.
all. Yeah. So Harrison, thank you very much for coming. For those who don't know, Harrison is the CEO of LangChain, and recently we've been doing a lot of things with LangChain. We published some connectors on the LangChain platform and did some good blog articles that were pretty successful. So glad to have you here. And AJ, I think is going to be an amazing job asking you tons of questions. So thank you for going through that.
Thank you for having me.
Again, thank you for being here. And thanks everybody for being here as well. Really excited to chat with you today. We've been following LangChain for a while now. Some of us are really new to it. And so we're here today as Airbiters, a mix of technical and non-technical folks. Some of us have been really deep in AI and some have not. Quickly, I'm AJ Steers or Aaron Steers. I'm in our AI team here at Airbyte, and I have background in data engineering and business intelligence and software. I understand you are a graduate of Harvard and you spent a few years in ML before you created this little company called LangChain. Why don't you tell us your story?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for having me. And it's great to meet so many of you in person for the first time as well. I think we've had a lot of awesome collaborations. And so it's great to be able to meet you in person. And yeah, this should be a fun conversation. So my name's Harrison. Background in ML and ML ops. So studied stats and CS at Harvard, then worked at Kensho, a fintech company in the Boston area on the ML team there for about 2.5 years. And then worked at Robust Intelligence, a company in the ML ops space doing testing and validation of machine learning models for about 3.5 years there. And the LangChain started, I was still at Robust Intelligence. I kind of knew that I was going to leave, but I didn't know what I was going to do next. And so I was going to, and this was last September, October, right around this time actually. And so right after Stable Diffusion, but before ChatGPT. So there was an interest in this space, but it hadn't quite exploded yet. And so I went to a bunch of meetups, chatted with a bunch of folks, and basically just saw some common abstractions in terms of what people were building, and happy to talk more about those types of applications and what those abstractions were. But basically saw some common abstractions, thought it would be fun to factor them out into a Python library, like not intending at all to start a company around it. I was still at my current job. I was like, the weekend kind of like project. I released that library, I think, and then started tweeting about it. I never really tweeted before, but got deep into that space. And was just having a lot of fun, and people started using it, and so kind of just kept on doing it. Turned it into a company end of this January, early February, with my co-founder Ankush, who I worked with at Robust Intelligence previously, and then he went on to manage my brother at a separate role. So he's worked with 2 out of 3 Chase brothers.
Nice.
And yeah, now we're 15 with people, with one more to join in late October. Based in SF, about a 20-minute walk from here. So I just walked over, so super easy.
Amazing. And happy 1 year birthday for LangChain, I think.
Yeah, almost October 24th. Yeah, it's coming up. Yeah.
So did you think that, did you have any idea when you started it that LangChain would be this big?
No, not at all. I remember chatting with Anton, who's one of the CTO and co-founder of Chroma. At one of these meetups that I went to. And I think I was like telling him, I have 4 ideas. And I think like the second one was LangChain. And then there was like 3 other ones. So I chose LangChain because it was like, it was a Python package. It was really easy to do on the side while I was at another job. So no, I think after like a month, I probably realized that there was probably like a company or something in this space. And that's when I started working more closely with Ankush and we started thinking about turning it into a company. But to start, no.
Nice. Yeah, I was looking at the timeline and you guys you started LangChain about a month before ChatGPT came out. And I didn't discover it until February, March. And by that time it was just, wow, this is amazing. But you had the insight and the good timing to just be right there, right as these things were taking off. Did you know that LLMs were going to be so huge? And when did you start to see that was, what was your first wow moment where you just got floored?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely didn't think they'd be as big as they are right now, for sure. I remember like after Stable Diffusion came out, I was like starting to pay more attention. And I think basically what happened was OpenAI had released a version of GPT-3 about 2 years ago, and then they like upgraded it, but they didn't really tell anyone when they upgraded it. It kind of like flew under the radar. And the first version was like not amazing, but then the second version was actually pretty good. And this is what people were building on around that time, the text DaVinci O2 models. And so it was pretty good. And I remember playing around with that and being like, oh wow, this is like a lot better than I kind of like expected. And so I think that kind of I think there were people building these like more complicated types of applications on top of the models, but not nearly to the extent that they are now. And then also like the rate of progress of the underlying models themselves has also just been like crazy exponential over the past like year. So I don't think I definitely didn't predict that. I'd say like the first thing that I built was during a company hackathon, and we built a chatbot that could answer questions about our I think like how the customer success basically notes that we were taking. So like, what's the status of this customer? Like, what are they blocked on? Where are they in the deployment process? Stuff like that. So a typical kind of like RAG-based application for those of you who know what that is, where it's combining a language model with data in your notion that it wasn't trained on. And that was probably the first, and we won the hackathon, so I got a free keyboard out of that. And
Nice.
that was probably the first time where I was like, okay, these are some like, this is pretty cool. Like people were pretty interested in that.
Awesome. So just let's go through a couple terms, because like I said, some people are really deep in this and some are not. So maybe if you could explain to us, like, I think the big ones are LLM and RAG and some of the other ones. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So the main like new thing here are the LLMs, the large language models, which are these text-based language models that basically aim to predict the next word in a sequence. And it turns out that when you feed it a lot of data and a lot of compute and give it a lot of parameters, predicting the next word starts to look like reasoning in some cases, or at very least, like it starts to look very intelligent and can do that very well. And the main way that you interact with these language models is through prompting. So the prompt is what you pass into the language model, and this can often contain instructions on how the language model should respond. It can contain examples of how it should behave. Or it can contain context in which it can ground its answer, and so that kind of gets to RAG. And some of the intuition behind this is that the language model is trained on a lot of data. There's a lot of there's a lot of space that it was trained on, and so when you pass in the prompt, and it's kind of almost conditioning the language model on the language that you pass in. So it's taking this vast amount of data that it was trained on and narrowing it down to like a more similar space that it was kind of trained on, and then there's a lot of emergent capabilities that come because it was trained on so much data with so many parameters. The big limitation of this is that language models only know what they're trained on, and so if you want it to know about up-to-date data or about your company's private data or things like that, you need to basically do something to provide that context to the language model. One way to do that is to fine-tune the language model on your data, but that can often be expensive, a little bit error-prone, and so a more kind of simple way is you just pass in information in the prompt. And so if I'm asking something about like how many commits were to the Airbyte code base yesterday, what you could do is you could fetch some information, pass that in, and then ask the language model to reason over that information.
So maybe it's like a preface to the question. You got the context above, and then here's the question.
Yeah, exactly. It's like I think like the one way to think about it is like when you have exam in school and you can like look at your textbook, like you can look for the answer in your textbook. And so that's kind of like the context that you're passing it. Right.
Awesome. So let's talk about open source. We're an open source company. We really believe in the power of open source. I understand this was your first open source project.
Yes.
And with, I think, 1,600 contributors as of now and 60,000 stars, I'd say it's a pretty good first project.
It's actually, I think it's technically my second one.
Okay.
The first one I had was like a little library for scraping like basketball stats, and it has like 1 star or something.
I'll go check that out right away. Well, so what made you, when did you know it should be open source, and how did that influence the path that you went through?
Yeah, I mean, if we're being 100% honest, it was just kind of an artifact of, I was starting a project while I was already at another company. I wanted to do it kind of like in the open. I didn't know if it was going to be a company.
Yeah.
So it was kind of just like, how can I, put something fun out into the world and have people use it? I think open source is a great way to do that. I do think that something like LangChain, if I was building, like if I hadn't done that and I was starting a company, I was building something like LangChain, it would still be open source. I think like it's very much like a framework, more similar to kind of like PyTorch in some sense. And I don't really know how that could be like a closed source thing. And then I think the other big thing that is really important to us, and I think probably resonates with a lot of you here, is the number of integrations that LangChain kind of like relies on and helps make it. Like part of LangChain is connecting language models to all these different tools, whether it be vector databases or APIs. And so having that be open source and having people be able to add their favorite ones and contribute to those and maintain those has been like massively successful. And that's where a lot of like the 1,600 contributors kind of come from.
Awesome. And why Python? Did you have Python experience just from the ML?
Yeah, that was kind of like the main language that I was writing, and really the only one that I know how to write. So
nice. I think now you have TypeScript and
yeah, we have a TypeScript package now. We brought on a few people early who have been great, like full stack and like, you know, if it was me and Ankush trying to do that, I think Ankush picked up TypeScript much faster than I, but if I had to do a lot of the TypeScript, it would not be nearly as good as it is. So we got like Jacob and, you know, some early employees who were really strong in the full stack experience. And one thing that we've seen is that I think Python's been the language that ML and data science people use. But now that these models are behind APIs, it completely opens it up for people who don't have ML experience. And a lot of those people write JavaScript and that ecosystem. So we wanted to kind of like appeal towards that.
Awesome. So I want to, before we leave the open source topic, we, like I said, we're managing a very large open source project with tons of contributions, requests, PRs all the time. How do you scale your PR management process? How do you as a team manage that?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to take notes from you guys. I think part of the way that we think about it is like, what do we want contributions in? What do we not want contributions in? So we do want contributions in like the long tail of integrations. We don't necessarily want contributions in like the core kind of like framework and bits. We've tried to make it as easy as possible. We've tried to like have good kind of like CI around linting and testing. And all of that stuff. But at the same time, we've tried to make it as easy as possible to not let people get blocked by that, like not let that be a reason that someone doesn't contribute to the library. And so we often kind of like take over people's PRs and like make format or something like that and get it over the finish line there. Let's see, those are maybe like the two big things that we do thoughtfully. Yeah, I mean, we were chatting a little bit about this earlier, but it's kind of like a blessing and a curse because it's obviously a blessing to have that many contributors, but there are a lot of PRs that don't, you know, that kind of like fall to the wayside a little bit. Like we just forget about them or we request some changes and then a month goes by and it's like 30 PRs down and so we never get to it.
Yeah, totally.
So that's something that we've struggled with. And that's something we're trying to be a little bit more thoughtful about. And so if you guys have any tips there, would be very open to that.
Cool. We'll chat after. Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm curious, I want to talk about like where the current AI fits in like the broader ML space. But before we go there, just your impressions of what is possible today versus what you expected a year ago. Because you're close to the space, you had enough foresight to create what you created and start this big bet. Is it moving faster or slower than you think you predicted a year ago?
I think it's moving like faster in some senses and slower in other senses. So I think the way that it's moving like really fast is that the models keep on getting better. There's multimodal seems right around the corner. Things like function calling where you can kind of like there's models that are fine-tuned to like know how to use tools, which a lot of what LangChain is connecting language models to APIs. So having it know how to use tools is really interesting. And so OpenAI came out with a model that was fine-tuned to use tools. And that happened way faster than I expected it to. And so I think in that sense, there's been a lot of awesome advancements. And there's been, but I'd say like the demos that are coming out have like been a lot faster. But like keyword on the demos, like I think the production kind of like implementations of a lot of these things are maybe going slower than I thought they would go. And that's because even though these language models can be really, really good and do lots of amazing things, they're not nearly at the reliability. Even as the ceiling keeps on increasing, the reliability doesn't necessarily increase at the same rate. And reliability for a lot of these applications is you know, super important. So I think a lot of some of the applications that are most popular are actually ones where reliability doesn't matter. So like character AI is maybe like, and even chat GPT, like if it gives you a bad response, it's not the end of the world. If you're writing like some application that like creates Python code and then runs it to like update your deployment or something like that, that like really matters. You can't have mistakes there. And so, yeah, I'd say like the prototypes are going a lot faster than I thought they would be, but the production instances are a bit slower.
Awesome. Well, that's a great segue to the ML ops topic in general. You mentioned you have ML ops background. I've been in the data space and been working adjacent to and with ML teams long enough that the stats are different depending on who you ask. But I just looked up, like McKinsey estimates about 15% of ML projects succeed, 15%, and Gartner estimates only 53% of AI projects make it from POC to production. That was true 3, 4, 5 years ago. It seems like it still is true today to some degree.
Yeah, I think it's. I was chatting with someone about this the other day, and I think one thing that has changed, and why I think we'll probably see more things in production, is that it's way easier to experiment now. So previously in ML, you had to gather a data set, you had to like rigorously define the objective that you're training it over, you had to train it, you then had to deploy and serve that model. And again, now the models are behind an API. A lot of them are really good like zero-shot learners, which basically means you can tell them what to do and they'll do it. And so it's really easy to prototype a lot of these features and get started that way. There's still this kind of like burden of taking them into production. Mm-hmm. Some of that is around like, it's just not clear what the right products for these LLMs are yet. Like it's only been a year. Like there's still a lot of space to like explore. And so I think a lot of the teams that we're seeing are still starting to find some of this like product market fit. And that gets to the point around like, yeah, if it was perfect, then it would be really easy to find product market fit for a lot of these things. Mm. If it was terrible, then you wouldn't even try. We're right now in this place where you can try and you can get good results. But you either have to pick the application really, really thoughtfully, or you have to like work to improve the results, and it's hard to do that. So I think it's way easier to experiment than before, but I think we're still finding out like what exactly it's good for and what it's not good for. And so I think like once that's more known, I think it'll be easier to take these types of applications into production than traditional ML ones. Mm-hmm. But I think there's a confounding factor where the UX just like isn't settled yet. So that's contributing to like this kind of like lack of productionization.
Yeah, you mentioned a good point about how certain applications, like my pet project that talks like Yoda, like it can fail and be silly and not work right, and nobody will mind. But if a key production part of your application, designing software and running it, doesn't work 100% of the time, we're in trouble. Can you talk about the chain part of LangChain and how you kind of imagined this product as not just a single go at, hey, LLM, answer the question, but answer the question, now I'm going to have another LLM check you. Things like that are built into, I think, the name. Talking about the name and how you address that problem.
Yeah, so the name LangChain comes from like language and then chaining things together. And the chaining things together can either be chaining multiple LLM calls together, or chaining an LLM call with a function call and then to another LLM call. And so the motivation for that and the way that we describe the applications that LangChain's good at creating internally now are context-aware reasoning applications. And I think both of those parts speak to the chaining part. So context-aware means bringing in the relevant context, whether it's from an API or some database or anything like that, connecting it to kind of like your data. And even if you just have kind of like a call to a database and then pass that to your LLM, that's kind of a chain in some sense. And so the kind of like that chaining of context helps it helps create good applications, and is part of what LangChain was founded around. Then there's also this idea of using multiple LLM calls or using LLM calls in a loop to do some reasoning. And this gets to the reasoning ability of language models and of language model applications. And so the simplest, I have some slides on this, and there's different kinds of like levels of reasoning. This is a big part of what's in LangChain, is like these kind of like cognitive architectures, so to speak. And so a really simple cognitive architecture is you just pass to the language model and ask it to give you a response. And so everything kind of like happens implicitly in the language model's weights. One of the things that we've seen that's kind of like made the need for chaining is that when you break it into more distinct steps, the language model performs better than if you ask it to kind of do everything at once. And so those can be kind of like distinct. So like in the levels, we have level 1, a single LLM call. Level 2, like a chain of LLM calls where there's kind of like a fixed, you do this, then you do this, then you do this. Level 3 in the cognitive reasoning is some type of like routing ability in there. So you can do this, and then you maybe choose between one of two options for actions that you can take. And that can be like a tool to call, or that can be a prompt to use, or that can be even choosing between different models. Different models have like pros and cons. And so you kind of like route between different options. Then levels 4 and 5 start to add some like basically cycles into it. And so that's when you get into things that are people commonly or like to call agents, which are basically kind of like a while loop with some code running in it and then a language model running in part of that code. And so in that while loop, there's different levels of scaffolding that you can put around like the actions that the language model takes inside that while loop. And basically, the more scaffolding you have, the more kind of like generally the more reliable they get, which is good. And then but at the same time, they're a bit more like application specific. And so level 5, the final one, is like basically no scaffolding at all. You kind of just have a while loop with the LLM thinking about what to do and then doing it. This is like auto GPT. It's very kind of like tantalizing because it's so simple and so powerful if done right. But it often lacks the scaffolding to kind of like do things reliably. So like these different levels of kind of like cognitive architectures are a lot of the chains and agents that are in LangChain and come out of the box. And kind of like, it helped inspire the name in terms of this like sequence of calls to take.
Awesome. And you mentioned tools again. So I want to maybe explain some examples of tools. We've all been, if we've played out in GPT, you probably asked something it didn't know about because it was past its ignorance threshold. And one example would be like a search engine. So you ask it about LangChain. LangChain didn't exist when it was trained. So it decides that fork in the decisioning framework is, I need a tool for this. What tools do I have available? I have a search engine. Let me figure out what this is. Could you say more about like those tooling, specifically the search, but maybe other things?
Yeah, I think actually looking at ChatGPT is a really good way to see some of these things kind of like in action. Because I would very much argue that ChatGPT is more of an agent than a language model. Even just the fact that it has like the memory and the conversational state is it's more than just a single stateless language model call. So like two of the most popular ChatGPT kind of like extensions are the browsing, which they just updated this past week, and then code interpreter. And so both of those are examples of, I would actually say they're examples of tool sets rather than tools. And so the distinction that I draw is that a tool set's kind of like a grouping of tools that are very related. So if you look at the actions of what's actually happening in the browsing of the ChatGPT browser extension, it can do several things. So it can like search, it can click on a web page, it can like go back. It basically has, I would guess, 3 to 10 different actions that it can kind of like take. And so at each cycle, it's kind of like deciding which of those actions to take and then taking it, observing it, and then repeating that. Code interpreter, it probably has fewer actions it could take, I would guess. It maybe just has one, like write code and then run code. And I think looking at how they've done that, it's instructive of how we expect applications to be in the future as well. We think the future is going to be more like agents with 3 to 5 specific tools for a specific task rather than like hundreds of tools generically. And so that's I think they kind of expect the same as well, which is why they have distinct kind of like agents for each one rather than one massive one.
Yeah. And now talk about, you mentioned Baby AGI and some of the other ones. Maybe just explain how that's different than traditional approaches to like language models. Yeah.
For Baby AGI?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Baby AGI, I think adds in it came out around the same time as Auto GPT. I think Auto GPT got a lot more attention. AutoGPT is basically this loop of asking a language model to think what to do, executing that action, think what to
What
do.
would be an example? Like, I think so many people, somebody told me, or maybe I saw this on one of the YouTube shorts, was improve my Instagram follows. And that kind of generic prompt to start, and it would start to fork out, something like that.
Yeah, so there's this other aspect to these agents, which is like how general and broad they can be. And so I think, yeah, a lot of what, for both AutoGPT and Baby AGI, initially they were very broad, like, yeah, improve my Instagram following, improve my net worth or something.
Yeah.
I think those are like, those tasks are very hard to do. And so it kind of didn't succeed a lot. Did you ever try out AutoGPT or Baby AGI?
No, but I saw enough like videos of people doing it, and one of the questions was always like, what's your token limit? Like how many, because all of these are internally cycling through multiple calls.
It takes a lot of
it takes a lot of compute. So no, I watched others, but yeah, haven't yet.
And so I think like recently, I think AutoGPT has gone a little bit more in trying to create AutoGPTs that are specialized for specific tasks. And so I think that's like almost a separate spectrum of like how broad are the tasks that you're asking it to do.
Mm-hmm.
Baby AGI added in basically a planning step. So it would kind of like think of, if you gave it a task, it would list out like 10 steps to do, do the first, and then revisit it. So it wasn't quite like thinking one step at a time. And I think this is actually, like, I think Baby AGI is actually more interesting than AutoGPT because of this planning step. But I think AutoGPT got a little bit more attention for whatever reason.
Yeah. And so do I understand correctly that they basically take a problem statement and ask themselves something of like, okay, break this into steps. And then they feed themselves the first step. And then they evaluate the results,
That's exactly
decide
right.
if they should go to the second step, and keep asking themselves, am I done yet? Am I done yet? Is this working?
Yeah, well, yeah. So not only like decide if they should go to the second step, but decide if they should update the steps that should be taken. And so they can like, Baby AGI can kind of like dynamically change its plan.
And it seems like that's almost emulating how we ourselves consider the problem. We think about it, we write down some steps, we start working on it, and we continually reevaluate, are we on the right path? Is this the right way?
I think the author Yohi had a great tweet where he was basically like, this is how I do my like daily, my daily planning. And so like, I just wanted to like, but I actually think that's, like when, I think that's really insightful because for a lot of these applications, they can be super complex and like super kind of like advanced. But a lot of the times when they fail, it's because they just lack the information that even humans would need to do the task.
Mm-hmm.
So like if I'm trying to schedule a meeting, if I don't have access to my calendar, like I can't schedule a meeting at the right time, right? And so I think that's a helpful framing to like think of like, hey, how would I do this task? And then try to like emulate that somewhat in the code.
Cool. Well, we're going pretty deep into now like the cutting edge or like the more hands-off approaches. We've gone from, okay, here's a basic prompt, spit out a response, to now, okay, here's a mission, good luck. As I'm talking with friends and colleagues about this, I often get the question of, is this sentient? Is there a consciousness there? And it's a legitimate question, but the more I've learned about the inner workings, the less that's been a concern for me. Could you say a little bit about your observation or how you answer questions like that?
Yeah, I don't have any super deep thoughts here. I don't think they're sentient at the moment. I also don't think we're super close to AGI actually for whatever it's worth, which may be surprising. And I also think a lot of the blockers to an AGI-like system are actually like engineering problems and hooking it up to kind of like tools in the real world. But I've also probably thought about this less than other people in the field, so I don't have a super amazing response to this.
So switching now to another completely adjacent but not related to that. I want to hear about Langsmith and LangHub. I think that's what you've called it.
I think we call it like Hub within Langsmith. We kind of need to work on the naming.
Yeah.
But yeah, we basically noticed that one of the big blockers for getting these things from prototype to production was being able to understand what exactly was going on inside these more complex applications. So as you're doing sequences of 2, 3, 4, 5 language model calls, basically understanding like what the sequence was, what the inputs and outputs were at each step becomes like really, really important for debugging and getting these things to work properly. And so Langsmith is basically our version of a debugger for these things. It shows the exact trace of exactly what's happening, the inputs and outputs at each step, and kind of allows for that more in-depth. I think a lot of what it allows for is just more rapid experimentation. Someone had a good quote on Langsmith that it improved kind of like their prompt velocity, so the rate at which they were able to experiment, because they could more easily like see what was going on, figure out what changes they might need to make. And remember, these are changes that are like maybe 2 or 3 steps deep inside a chain or agent. So they're often a bit like tricky to get at if you don't have kind of like that ability to debug in the middle of the chain or anything like that.
And are you also hosting the workloads in your service? Was that part of it?
Not yet. Yeah. So like I think the natural commercialization route for anything is like host it. So I think like hosted LangChain was like something we thought about early on. But I think hosting is not actually that difficult, and debugging was a lot more difficult for people.
Yeah.
So we decided to kind of like solve more what was the pain point for folks.
Cool. Yeah, and then say a little bit about the hub for I think it's prompts specifically. Yeah.
Yeah. So we noticed 2 things that were interesting. One, prompts were different for different language models. So a prompt that worked for ChatGPT might not work for Claude. And then 2, the people who were best at prompting often weren't the engineers. They were sometimes like the product managers or people with like domain expertise. And so both those kind of like contributed to this idea that there was this need for some way to share and collaborate on prompts outside of a typical kind of like engineering workflow. And so we launched that 3 weeks ago, I think at this point, and it has a bunch of different prompts with tags for different models. You can version them, collaborate with them on teammates. I think that whole like collaboration among different teammates is something with different kind of like engineering and technical abilities is something that we're just starting to see the start of as well for these language model applications. And so I don't think the hub is like in its final form, but I think there's something really interesting there.
Nice. Yeah. And I noticed you have like a playground aspect there where you can like take somebody else's prompt, put in your own snippets, and then push run and see how it behaves with your inputs.
Yeah, I think a lot of the prompt development is just really like iterative. Playing around with it, getting a feel for how these language models work. That's kind of like I think like one of the no one really knows how these things work at the end of the day, and that's part of why like OpenAI's or why they said they started to release a lot of it was because like even internally with their 100 or 200 employees, like they just couldn't discover enough of these like emergent properties quick enough. And so when they put it out, like a lot of the new insights are just coming from random people on Twitter, which is really exciting. And so I think being able to play with it is super fun.
I asked a colleague who is in the ML space to explain, this is early on, what the heck's with LLMs? Why are they like this? And I think her response was pretty classic. It's like the keyword is large. And it's like something about the emergent properties of this much language fed into the model, tuned properly. It makes it something of an emergent property that like combined with the, attention is all you need paper. It's been super interesting to watch. And it is interesting also that we are just learning about it as we play with it. We didn't know about it before we made it, which is just interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. I think, it also makes like evaluation of these things really difficult. So I was talking with someone from OpenAI, and they were basically saying as these models get better and better, you don't even know how to evaluate them anymore. Because the idea behind these emergent properties is that it's not just like a linear increase in capabilities. It's like blah, 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 boom, and then it just like shoots up. Mm-hmm. And so like you don't know what you should be evaluating a model that's like 10 sizes bigger or something like that.
I want to talk about some of the primitives you put into LangChain. I remember when I was going through your docs, I think this is back in March, and I remember seeing, prompts, gonna blank on it because, I'm in front of a bunch of people, but it was prompts, agents, tools, plugins, the language model itself, the vector store, the loaders. And I was really admiring what you guys as a company did to kind of pilot these paradigms for programming. And I kind of felt like I was learning over again, like classes and inheritance and object orientation, but like not that. This is now a new way of programming that's around languages.
Yeah, I think there's I think there's 2 big value props to LangChain. One's like the chains and agents and having these cognitive architectures that you can pull off the shelf and get started with. the other one is like having all these different modules with a standard interface, and then a lot of like implementations or integrations with them. And so there's obviously a lot of stuff around working with the language models. So I think the three there are like prompts, which are the inputs, the models themselves, and then output parsers, which parse the output into some kind of like more structured format. Then there's a lot around data and retrieval. So loading documents, splitting documents into chunks, embeddings, vector stores, things like that. And then there's kind of like things related to agents. So memory, tools, toolkits, agent type, things like that. I think there's also like, these are constantly evolving as well. And I think like that's part of the fun and challenge of building a library for language models over the past year is that, when we started off, all the language models were just text in, text out. And then they released chat models, which are like chat messages in a single chat message out. And that like messed up all our abstractions. And so I think like trying to have these interfaces and keep them standard while at the same time keeping up with OpenAI and other folks, it's probably like the biggest challenge that we have.
Yeah, and I think that's fantastic that the people who don't know LangChain might just assume it's not doing all the work, but actually it plugs in neatly to either OpenAI or Azure OpenAI or Hugging Face or bring your own LLM
or
Airbyte, yes, and we'll get to that in a second. But yeah, so on the LLM side specifically, and on the embeddings and on the vector stores, you really are kind of plug and play with all of these different integration points. And the same abstraction would work regardless of whether you're using Pinecone or Chroma.
Yeah, I think that's definitely been part of the reason that people even sometimes like move on to LangChain from their own kind of like pre-built thing, is that it makes it really easy to try out these different things. Whether it be vector stores, we often see you get started with something super lightweight in memory like Chroma, then you go to production. Okay, you got to swap it out for something that has a hosted version. For models, there's just so many new ones coming out all the time. And so having the ability to switch between them is really, really powerful.
On the Airbyte side, we have, I think, 9 connectors that we've brought in, and also like a wrapper.
I think there's a lot.
I think we have a generic CDK plugin, and then I think we have HubSpot, Salesforce, Shopify, Stripe, Zendesk, Typeform, a JSON-L, and then the CDK one. I think they can plug in one. How have you like observed the ecosystem? Like how much does it like affect users when they can get the data out of their systems? How many people complain about not being able to get data from their XYZ source system?
That's like, so I think there's 3 big problems or 3 big challenges in building LLM apps. One's like the orchestration of the cognitive architecture. And I think that's like a lot of what we've talked about already. 2 is just like plain old fashioned data engineering. Like it's about bringing the right context to the language model. And a lot of that's loading the data, having it kind of like transformed in some way, storing it reliably. And so I think that's where a lot of these connectors help and are clutch. Like, I think like that's like, there's just like so much data engineering that actually goes into creating interesting applications. And then the third thing is just prompt engineering. And I think those 3 things are where we see people spending the most time.
Awesome. You mentioned transforms, and this is something we've discussed internally quite a lot, because we excel in getting data from anywhere to anywhere as efficiently, quickly, reliably, high fidelity as possible. But we're not trying to transform your data in flight, and I think there's good reasons not to do it in flight. We've made an exception when we're loading data into a vector store. The chunking and embedding are valid use cases to do on the way. I'm curious what other transformations you see in the, specifically for text sources. And is it fine in most cases to simply chunk, index, and store, or are there other transformations you're seeing business users want?
I think there's maybe 2 more that I'd add. One is, and I guess they're both kind of related, but it's around like pre-processing of the text, basically. So either cleaning it or adding additional metadata to it. So if you think about like a web page that you get from the internet, like the raw HTML is like a bit cumbersome to work with. And so a lot of pre-processing steps are like formatting that in a better way. At the same time, there's often like a lot of interesting metadata in that HTML, even if it's just like, what section is this or something like that. And so I don't think text splitting is as simple as just split like every 1,000 characters.
Mm-hmm.
You need to make sure that it's carrying over kind of like the relevant metadata. And often that metadata can be added in, and it's not even from the original page. So there's some interesting stuff around kind of like adding in metadata, such as like the summary of the pull page and having that be a single metadata attribute for each tag, and using like an LLM to do that. So I'd say like the general flow is kind of like load text, pre-process / clean it, add in metadata, split it, making sure to carry over metadata where appropriate, create embeddings for those splits, and maybe on the metadata for those splits as well, and maybe for other things as well. Maybe that's abstracted as like index these splits in some way.
Yeah, I like that idea of adding the summary as also metadata. We've thought a lot about this, and definitely on our radar is where did the document come from? What chunk of it? What's my header structure for this text blurb that I'm on right now? And what format should we pass along? Should it be HTML or plain text or Markdown or something like that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting work in figuring out different like how exactly does this metadata make its way into the index of whatever you have. So if you have a summary, is that getting included in the embedding for each chunk? Is that a separate embedding, and now you have 2 embeddings for each chunk, and you kind of like search across all of those? I think there's a lot of interesting work there. I'd say like 80% of the use cases are still kind of just the standard, chunk things up, put them in a vector store. You maybe have some embedding, but you don't use it too thoughtfully. And then after that, it gets like kind of application specific as well.
Yeah.
So that's something that we struggle with, is like how to let people get started super easily, but then also let them have the flexibility to add in like arbitrary metadata if that's like important to their application, because sometimes it really is, but like what that is completely different for your application compared to someone else's. So we don't have any amazing insights there, but I think
that's super helpful. I mean, even classifying the primary value add being the metadata addition, that's super helpful for us as we think about what we want to put in that space and what we want to save space for.
Yeah.
So yeah, great. Thank you. So I want to talk, time check. I think we've got about 15 minutes left. I want to leave I wanted to leave 15 minutes for questions, but I want to ask a couple more on future trends before we switch to...
I'll answer them quickly.
Okay, cool. No promises. So first of all, I've been just fascinated by where the LLM will live in the future and what the integration points will be. I know all of our phones have a GPS and a map service and a Bluetooth service and a payment service. Will our phones, do you think, and other OSs have an LLM service either backed in the phone or backed on the cloud?
Yeah, probably. Yeah. And I think some of them will probably be on the phone, and then there'll be some that are in the cloud and only accessible through APIs. I think as there starts to get more and more models, some of them are small enough and good enough where they can just live locally and run locally. For a lot of the more interesting stuff, you'll probably need one of the like really big models that only OpenAI or Google or maybe Anthropic will have, and those will only be kind of like cloud available or something like that. And I think it kind of depends on the use case, and I think both will exist. I don't think it's one or the other.
Where do you think the traditional ML, and you're coming from the space, so I think you're well suited to answer it. Like traditional TensorFlow, predictive modeling, classification algorithms, all the traditional ML work. Does that stay and thrive, or is some of that supplanted or replaced by AI or LLM approaches?
I think it stays. I think LLM approaches can maybe even help with some of it. So like LLMs can generate synthetic data to train like text classifiers on, where you just want to have a binary classification or something like that. Yeah, and that's actually been a pretty big use case for LLMs that we've seen, is this just generation of synthetic data to train on. So yeah, I think it stays and is augmented a little bit probably.
Okay. And obviously we all have hobbies, and some have more or less time to invest in this. But when do you think you will personally have a Jarvis just helping you all the time?
5 to 10 years ish, depending on how good you expect Jarvis to be.
Cool. All right. Well, I want thank you, by the way, and I want to open up to questions. We'll give you a mic, and we'll just ask you to say your name. Who has a question they'd like to ask?
I've heard talked about how, demos are easy to come by, prod applications not so much. What are some of the production applications you've seen that have been the most exciting or the most technically impressive?
I think the so one that I saw literally when I was walking over here is Cal.com has an email assistant now. And so basically I think the ones that are more interesting are the ones that start to become like agent-like. I think email is like a pretty good first one. We actually did a webinar with Andrew from Shortwave the other week, and they have an email assistant. Um, and I think email is good because it happens over text already, so you don't need to like add in any extra modalities or do a lot of things like that. Andrew owns the Shortwave, like owns all the email data already, so they already kind of like have those integrations, and it's adding it into the platform there. I guess the the Cal.com one was more of like a calendar management one, but they like own the calendar, so they have that data there. So I think those are, in both of those, I would consider kind of like agents. And I think those are probably like two of the more technically advanced ones. Other ones that I think are good are things where personalization starts to come at the forefront. So we work with one enterprise who's basically doing personalized like Christmas emails to all their customers based on kind of like their purchase history and stuff like that. And so they're using the language model to kind of like reflect over that data and then generate some kind of like personalized email on that side. And I think that's really cool because I think we'll start to see more. Part of the power of LLMs is like, and just generative AI in general, is the ability to generate things specifically on demand, which I think you can generalize like for specific people. And so I think like in a futuristic world, in the limit, this goes to like everyone has music that's generated for them or TV shows that are generated for them. And I think we're still a long way from that, but I think like approaches that start to go there are very interesting to me.
Question? Next. Everybody's shy. Here you go.
So 6 months ago, I was doing a one-on-one with John. We were walking LinkedIn, and John was super excited about LLM and say, "Oh, that's amazing! We're going to be able to crank out so much content." And I was like, "Yeah, if we start doing that, think about how many people like you at use, and how much content is actually going to be created using these models. And maybe it's going to take 6 months, maybe it's going to take 1 year, but a lot of the companies are going to realize the value and the efficiency that you get for writing, I don't say good, but content. And I was going to be living in a world where 90% of the content that we find online on blogs is going to be generated by ChatGPT or by any kind of LLM powered application. And what does that actually mean for us who like to create high quality content? Is it going to be drowned in an ocean of fake content?
Yeah, really good questions. My not super thought out answer is that there'll be like in the short term, there'll be a wave of like generated content, but then I think that actually puts more of a premium on content that is human generated or is human curated, or at the very least. And so I think a funny example that popped up over the past few weeks is I think I have the sequence right, but I think Quora used ChatGPT to answer a question, and then Google pulled in that Quora answer, which was generated on ChatGPT, but the ChatGPT answer was incorrect. It like hallucinated something. And so then the top Google answer is now like an incorrect response. I forget the exact example, but you have this like, this cycle where, it's getting shown as like some of the responses from Google. So yeah, I think more of that will happen in the short term, probably. But I do think that does mean that like content, is coming from a human and that you trust to be kind of like high validity, like arguably like, like I don't know exactly what the New York Times is doing to embrace this, but I'm assuming like they're probably more reluctant than other people to have AI generated content on their website. And I'm assuming they have like human produced is like, part of the core staple of the New York Times. And so I think you'll actually start to see institutions like that probably take on like more value as they kind of like use that as a differentiator and like say, no, like this is human curated. You can trust this.
So this is the time for us to brand ourselves as human generated.
Yes.
Wonderful. Here you go. Say your name and your question.
Cool. And my name is Claes, and the context my brand would be on the security. So where do you think the biggest risk now with LLM security is, and where do you think we're working?
Yeah, great question. I think the biggest risk is probably when you start hooking LLMs up to tools, because that's when they can start and start having like actions that are taken based on the LLM's output. I think that's when it starts to become really dangerous. I think if you look at something again, if we look at what OpenAI is doing and how they're tackling all of this, there are a lot of examples of coming out where you can kind of like do some prompt injection and trick ChatGPT to say something bad. And I don't actually think they really care that much about that, because you're tricking it to do something to yourself, and it's kind of like funny, but there's no implications. If you look at like Code Interpreter, where it's like running code, what they did was they gave it a tool, and it's like, coding's like a very powerful tool, but it's in a sandbox environment. It's like locked down. And so I think a lot of it's just like making sure that you give it access to like properly controlled tools. And that's kind of like where I'd focus a lot. And that's where we are focusing a lot of the attention as well. We're not super concerned about prompt injection that kind of lets people trick the language model into saying something bad. We're more focused on like, what tools are we giving it? What's the permissions on those tools? Are those clearly communicated? Things like that.
Awesome. Anybody from this side? Questions? Yeah. No? No? More?
What, how, with which jobs do you see being like most effective or like made defined by AI in your personal opinion?
I think a lot of the jobs that are, I think it will get really good at like reading and writing content. And so if you're doing something that's translating like one text thing into another text thing, or one text thing into some structured data, or kind of like some data entry jobs, I think are kind of like a good place for automation for a lot of this. I do think like every job will be touched by it. Like I use ChatGPT all the time to help code, and it's great. And so I do think every job will be touched positively by it. But yeah, the jobs that I would expect to get automated away more quickly than others are this kind of like, data entry thing where it's mostly like text to text. There's not a lot of kind of like,
Next. One. We have about 4 more minutes. Or we can wrap up. Do you have any expectations for the coming year? I think down 1 year with LangChain. What do you want to do with the next one?
I'm really excited for multimodal. I think that'll be fun. I think all the examples coming out of Chat GPT V or whatever they're calling it are really interesting, and so I'm excited for API access for that. I think the open source models, explosion of those are really interesting as well. I think there's been a lot of space there, and the idea of running these things locally is really interesting as well. For LangChain in particular, I think a lot of our focus is just on this prototype to production kind of like thing. And so I think that's a big focus of ours, is just working with people to get more of these applications in production, because I think it's great to have them as Twitter demos, but it's better to have them as real products. So
awesome. And thank you so much. Thank you for being here. Thanks everybody for questions. And really appreciate your time.
No, thank you guys for having me. Excited to be working together.